Let's just hear more about the case from Andrew Plant, BBC reporter for Points West, who's been covering the story. And it was a breach of procedure, no question, Andrew, wasn't it?
Hi, Jeremy. Yeah, let me just take you back, actually, to 2011, the 19th of March. That was when Sian O'Callaghan, a 22-year-old woman from Swindon, an office worker, she was in a nightclub called Suju's in the Old Town area of Swindon. Now, she was last seen on the CCTV cameras there just after 2 o'clock. And then that was it. She completely vanished. And there was a massive public search for her, people taking days off work in the next 3 or 4 days to go and search a place called Savernake Forest, which is a few miles outside of Swindon. And that's where police had said her mobile phone had last pinged. So the last time it contacted a phone mast, it was somewhere near that forest. People looking for her, asked to try and keep their eyes out for her handbag, that sort of thing that people knew she had on her when she was last seen. Now, Christopher Halliwell, his taxi had been spotted on a police number plate recognition camera, just one single image, which turned out to be the clue that finally caught him and that unravelled this whole saga. They followed him for a couple of days. Finally, they arrested him. They read him his rights, they cautioned him, and then they persuaded him to take them to Sian's body. And he went with them to Uffington, the Vale of the White Horse, where that chalk white horse is carved out into the hillsides in Oxfordshire. And there he showed them where he'd dumped Sian's body. Now, at that point, as you've said, that's when he dropped another bombshell. As they were standing just a few yards from where Sian's dead body lay, he told Detective Inspector Fulcher, "There's another one. I've done another one. I don't know if you want to go for another one." They had a fairly long conversation. That's been detailed, some graphic stuff in there. But the upshot was that within the next hour or so, they then drove 20 miles across the countryside into a different county, into Gloucestershire, to another field known as Oxo Bottom Field. Now, using a dry stone wall there, a dip in the wall as a reference point, he paced out into that field and told police where to dig. And after 24 hours or so, after getting mechanical diggers in to get through the very stony soil in the ground there, they found a skeleton. And that skeleton, through DNA testing, was later identified to be Becky Godden, who disappeared 8 years before, last seen on the 3rd of January in Swindon, 2003.
Now, the problem then was that Halliwell decided to retract that second confession. Is that right?
That's right. And this is the bit that seems absurd to most people. So let me make it as simple as I can. The point where he led police to Sian's body, basically confessing to her murder, and then led police to another body, essentially confessing to a second murder, none of that was admissible in court. And that's because Detective Inspector Fulcher was judged to have broken Christopher Halliwell's rights. Now, the PACE guidelines, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, say quite clearly what you need to do when somebody confesses to a crime. And they are very simply, you need to get them legal representation and you need to do that in a police station. There are some grey areas. You're allowed to do, for example, an emergency interview. But Fulcher very clearly broke Christopher Halliwell's rights, broke those PACE guidelines, and so it was ruled that none of that was admissible in court. Now, because Sian had been dead for 4 days, there was lots of other evidence to link Christopher Halliwell to her death. There was DNA evidence from Christopher Halliwell on her body, for example. So they could proceed with a trial against him, charging him with the murder of Sian O'Callaghan. But because Becky had lain in her shallow grave in that field for probably over 8 years, there was no other evidence to link Christopher Halliwell to her murder except for that confession. And because that wasn't admissible as evidence, there was nothing to bring a charge against him for Becky's murder. So he was charged and he pleaded guilty to Sian O'Callaghan's murder, but couldn't be charged with the murder of Becky.
And the thing that seems to really upset people is that Mr. Fulcher, the policeman, is then disciplined in some way and leaves the force.
That's right. So it really polarised opinion. In the opinion of Becky Godden's mum, who hadn't seen her daughter since 2002, the end of 2002, she was extremely grateful to Detective Inspector Fulcher for finally figuring out what had happened to her daughter. She said that if it hadn't been for him, they may never have discovered where her body was. No one would ever have stumbled across that remote field in the middle of Gloucestershire. But Becky's father, for example, well, he was very angry with police. He said that because they'd broken procedure, Christopher Halliwell, who had effectively admitted to killing his daughter, was never going to face justice for that crime. In terms of his bosses, well, he was subject to disciplinary procedures. He was found guilty of gross misconduct. He wasn't fired for that, but he eventually resigned from the force. And it was really because his reputation had been so damaged by this incident. But still to this day, some people think he did the right thing and some people think otherwise.
Now the case of Becky Godden seemed to just have been, very unfortunately, one that they couldn't proceed with. But obviously they worked on it and they got something else, did they?
That's right. So it was, if you like, just a dusty file sitting on a desk. Christopher Halliwell was already in prison. He was convicted of murdering Sian O'Callaghan. He was given a life sentence with a minimum term of 25 years. So for a lot of people, that was enough. He was already a convicted murderer. He was already in prison. But for a few policemen and policewomen on Wiltshire Police, well, that wasn't okay because he hadn't faced justice for this crime, which he was clearly, in their minds, guilty of. So they picked up that dusty file and they set to work. And what they did was they looked for other evidence to try and bring this case back to court. Now, one thing they found was in Christopher Halliwell's shed in the street where he lived in Swindon, or had lived before he went to jail. And they found in there some tools, specifically a shovel or a spade, and that had on it some old soil samples. Now, they had those analysed and they found that those soils matched the fingerprint of the soil, the makeup, if you like, of the soil in the field where Becky had been buried. So that was one big piece of evidence, the fact that this shovel, they said, had been used to dig that shallow grave. So that was something that linked Christopher Halliwell to that crime. But the real deal breaker was this. The legal team successfully argued that because he'd pleaded guilty to Sian's murder, they could then use that as evidence in Becky's trial. And what they argued was that there were so many similarities between the way Sian had been killed and the way that they said Becky had met her death. Specifically, the fact that they were lone females, that they were strangled, that they were then stripped of their clothing, and that they were then taken to remote locations. He even admitted in court that he had been thinking about burying Sian's body. Of course, he was arrested before he had the chance to do so. But what they argued was there were so many similarities that, in fact, it was almost a method of murder. This was his way of operating, and the way he'd killed Sian, which we already knew he did because he'd admitted it, well, that was very, very similar to the way that Becky had been killed too.
Thank you very much, Andrew Plant, BBC reporter for Points West, who's been covering the Halliwell case.